Welcome back. I hope that you are now well underway to reading Virgil's Aeneid. By now you should have gotten through the first three books and should be ready to move on to the next three books next week, books 4, 5, and 6. I hope that you appreciate the growing tension between Aeneas, the Trojan traveler, and the Carthaginian queen Dido. If you have not already gotten to it, you will soon be seeing book 4, the quite tragic conclusion of the relationship between Aeneas and Dido. Now, it's important to understand that it's not by accident that the Romans put so much attention in Aeneas about Dido, so much attention on Dido. The whole point here is that Dido essentially is the unfortunate villain in the piece, as well as the victim, essentially, of Roman heroism, so to speak. She is in the Romans' way, plain and simple. And in fact, there is quite a bit of history with heroism through Greek and Roman literature, as you already saw with Ovid's Heroides, and we talked about in a different video, about the women who are essentially dispossessed by the men whom they thought they could rely upon to take care of them or have some type of satisfying relationship with. So Ovid gives voice to those women. It's quite interesting to see that there was enough material in the annals of Greek and Roman mythology, especially with heroes, to see quite a few women who end up suffering the consequences of heroism essentially visited upon them just by virtue of who the heroes are as men. So not a good thing. So Dido is one such, as you already saw in Ovid's Heroides letter of Dido to Aeneas. Now, in Virgil's Aeneid, we get the full story of exactly what's going on with Dido. What we now need to understand, backing away from Aeneas for a bit, is to go back and talk about, with our history of Roman expansion, exactly what did go on with Carthage. Once again, this is a very detailed, complex story, and I'm not going to be able to give more than a cursory introduction to it here, but it's enough to understand some of the basic details so that you can see where this led. So Carthage itself, as you could hopefully divine from the pages of Aeneid, is originally a Phoenician colony. The Phoenicians lived over in the far east Mediterranean, approximately where Canaan is and where Israel, Lebanon, those countries are today. The Phoenicians were the best known seafarers, the most successful seafarers also, in the Mediterranean world before either the Greeks or the Romans. And they founded several major colonies, including Carthage, which is where Tunisia is today in North Africa, and also Massalia in southeast France, which eventually became the city Marseille. Now, the Phoenicians themselves traveled quite widely and did quite a bit of merchant trading and colonization, as we talked about. But they, and although they did have possessions in many places, the Phoenicians aren't especially known for having a particularly wide empire as such. The Romans themselves, of course, are taking over territory in a much more aggressive and possessive manner, and so therefore, if the Carthaginians are going to put up any resistance to the Romans' movements outward from Italy, then the results are obviously going to be quite sanguinary. Now, the first area of conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans involves the island of Sicily. Now, the Carthaginians had expanded their territory into Sicily in the past, and in fact, there already had been a major series of conflicts between Carthaginians and Greeks for territory within Sicily. And one of the big occurrences was in 480 BC, a battle called Himera, between Carthaginians and Greeks over that particular city in Sicily and other surrounding territories. So there already had been a long, fairly bloody history between Carthaginians and other peoples trying to occupy territory within territory outside of North Africa proper. So it's in this kind of very tense environment that in the 200s BC, the Romans step. Now, the Romans themselves had some allied cities already established in Sicily, even though the Romans themselves had not started expanding yet to begin possessing territory. In the mid-200s BC, leading to the first of these three Punic Wars, Punic meaning Phoenician, Punic Wars in 264 BC. The problem comes up with a city called Messene, up in the northeast corner of Sicily, which gets into difficulties with Carthaginians and appeals to Rome for assistance. A long, intermittent, and up-and-down war results from that particular appeal to Rome from 264 to 241 BC, and it involves not only Sicily itself, but also the nearby islands of Sardinia and Corsica. The outcome eventually in 241 BC is that the Romans are able to defeat the Carthaginians after a long, protracted, and very difficult engagement with them, and they ultimately take over the island of Sicily. Now, the Carthaginian general in charge of the campaign against the Romans was named Hamilcar Barca, Hamilcar, that's Hamilcar, and then Barca, B-A-R-C-A, Hamilcar Barca. Now, you may not particularly know him, but I'm quite certain that you have heard of his much more famous son. That would be Hannibal. He is the famous one of the elephants. So Hamilcar Barca fought as courageous as he could against the Romans, but was ultimately taken down by them. And the Romans, as we say, were able to seize the island of Sicily away from the Carthaginians. Now, due to later developments in Roman-Carthaginian relations, unfavorable ones, Hannibal, after his father's death, began trying to expand Carthaginian territory again, and in particular, he made his way all the way into Spain and attacked a Roman allied city out there, Saguntum. And that was going to initiate the Second Punic War. The actual attack happened in 221 BC, but the formal declaration of war took a couple of years to put in place. So that's why we date this war from 219 BC. So Hannibal himself was successful at taking his army, including his elephants, famously, through Spain, all through Gaul, across the Alps, and apparently bones of elephants were found up there to prove this, and eventually down into Italy itself. Hannibal proved to be a terror to the Romans, who had not yet really had too much direct experience with foreign invasion, even though they did have plenty of experience, of course, with their legions. And the Romans were caught flat-footed. And most famously, in 216 BC, Hannibal defeated the Romans in a pitched battle called Cannae, in which Hannibal basically drew the Romans into a trap. The Romans found themselves chasing after the Carthaginians into a box canyon, and then when the Romans were in the correct location, all of a sudden, Carthaginians came in from all sides, ambushing the Romans and completely annihilating that legion. That was such a disastrous defeat for the Romans that they went so far as to put a 3-day festival called the Nefas, N-E-F-A-S, commemoration on their calendar to commemorate this disaster, so that the Romans would never again forget the awful occurrence of being defeated by this Carthaginian invader. They were never going to allow themselves to forget. All right. Well, Hannibal got to the point of actually bringing his army up to the walls of Rome, and he came very close to, in fact, making an invasion on Rome. The Romans, however, even though this was contrary to their nature, sent a general named Fabius out to deal with Hannibal. And Fabius's tactics were essentially a form of guerrilla warfare, in which he would make spitting attacks at Hannibal's army and then quickly backing away in order to never engage in battle proper. The Romans had in fact had prior experiences in Africa itself, in which they observed that this was the barbarian approach, as they would see it, with the Africans, of essentially attacking and then running away, and so never actually committing to a bitch battle the way the Romans and the Greeks were both used to. And so Fabius started chasing Hannibal all around Italy, attacking but never actually engaging in a direct battle. As a result, Fabius earned the nickname in Latin cunctator, which means delayer. And by chasing Hannibal around and keeping him busy for several years, Fabius was eventually able to wear him down enough and wear down the Carthaginian strength enough with that army that to give another big name in Roman military history, Scipio, later on Scipio Africanus, the first of two Scipios, the opportunity to make a counterattack back at Carthage itself. This finally happened in the very late 200s BC, and Hannibal finally had to be recalled in order to defend his home city. Eventually, in 202 BC, the Romans and the Africans finally had an opportunity, as it turned out, to face off in a direct pitched battle, finally, in Zama, Z-A-M-A, a plain not far away from Carthage. And the Romans defeated the Carthaginians, and that brought an end to that piece of Carthaginian resistance. The treaty was made in 201 BC, concluding the Second Punic War, and the Romans put a great many clauses in the treaty insisting that the Carthaginians would be permitted to maintain the territory in North Africa that they already had, but they were not to set foot outside of North Africa and were absolutely not to lay their hands in any way on any Roman possessions. Now, the Romans became aware, however, that during this war, that the Carthaginians were not alone. They had some help from Macedonians and Greeks, but most notably Philip V, the king of the Macedonians, who ended up allying with Hannibal. Consequently, the Romans, as soon as the Carthaginians were dispatched in the Second Punic War, made their efforts quickly to take on both Macedonia and Greece. We're going to take on them in the next part of the video, but it's important to understand that Macedonia and Greece were sort of next in line for the Romans once Carthage was taken down. So, 149 BC, some years later, the Carthaginians made an aggressive advance against Roman territory down in North Africa. The Romans were quick with the punishment. 146 BC, Carthage, after a quick and bloody war, was finally besieged. It surrendered, and it was razed to the ground. And the soil all around was sown with salt to make it infertile. So for quite a few years, nothing could be built in that area, even though eventually the city of Carthage was rebuilt. But now this area, of course, in North Africa became a Roman province, and so Carthage was essentially a subordinate city to the Romans, and there was very little specific difficulty from Carthage itself, although the Romans had quite a bit more work to do to deal with North Africa proper. One Latin phrase that we have surviving from this portion of Roman history is the phrase Carthago delenda est. This is the famous phrase by the first of two senators named Cato, and therefore we call him Cato the Elder. Stories go, according to Livy, that when Cato gave any speech on any other subject in the Senate, he would always conclude every speech with this phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. So he kept insisting over and over again that Carthage had to be taken down. And although it took a number of years to accomplish, the Romans eventually did it. Not absolutely coincidentally, 146 BC was also the year in which the Romans were successful at taking down Greece. And that's the subject of our next video. So we'll see you next video, and we'll continue the subject of Roman military expansion in middle to late Roman Republican history.